The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, folded into thirds and sealed with a dab of red wax that had cracked somewhere along its long journey from Caldwell, Kansas to the quiet Ohio town of Millbrook. And when Eva Ellsworth broke that seal and unfolded the single page, she did not expect to find a warning written in her cousin Margaret's sharp, slanted hand. But there it was, staring up at her in ink as dark as a brand. Do not come to Caldwell looking for work or adventure or whatever romantic notion has taken hold of you, Eva, Margaret had written. And above all else, do not go near a man named Hugh Barker. He is the kind of man that ruins women not with malice, they say, but with that easy smile and those steady hands and a reputation as long as the Kishom Trail itself. He has been in more trouble than I can account for in one letter. Stay in Ohio. Stay safe. Eva read it once. Then she read it again slowly, her finger tracing the name, Hugh Barker. She folded the letter. She set it on the kitchen table beside her cold cup of coffee. She looked out the window at the gray Ohio morning, at the frost-killed garden and the mud street, and the same 3 houses she had looked at every single day for 23 years. Then she stood up, walked to her bedroom, and began to pack her trunk. It was the spring of 1878, and the cattle drives were at their peak, and Caldwell, Kansas sat just above the Kansas Indian Territory border like a lit match balanced on a powder keg. It was a rough town and a raw town, and it was exactly the kind of place that Eva Ellsworth, who had grown up in a house where the loudest sound was her father clearing his throat, had been quietly dreaming about for years. She was not reckless. She was not naive. She simply understood, in the clearest way a person can understand something, that the life available to her in Millbrook's schoolteacher, eventually someone's quiet wife, was not the life that was meant for her. Her father did not try hard to stop her. He knew his daughter. Her mother pressed a small Bible into her hands and cried at the train station. Eva hugged her and promised to write every week, and she meant it fully. And then she climbed aboard the westbound train and did not look back, because looking back was the one thing she was genuinely afraid of. The train ride took 3 days, with changes in Columbus and St. Louis and another in Wichita. And by the time the locomotive pulled into Caldwell, Eva's back ached and her dress was filmed with coal dust, and she had eaten nothing but hard biscuits and a strip of dried beef since the Missouri border. She stepped down onto the platform with her trunk in one leather satchel and stood for a moment in the afternoon light, listening. Caldwell was loud. It was the kind of loud that lived in the body rather than just the ears, horses clopping on packed dirt, men shouting across the wide main street, the distant crack of something that might have been a board falling or might have been something else, music spilling from 2 different saloons at the same time and tangling in the air into something that was not quite music at all. Cattle pens sat at the southern edge of town, and the smell of them reached everywhere. Dust rose in small columns where the wind pushed it. A woman in a red dress stood in the doorway of an establishment called the Red Garter, watching Eva with mild, professional curiosity. Eva straightened her back, picked up her trunk handle, and started walking. Margaret met her at the door of the boarding house she ran on 2nd Street, a narrow 2-story affair with a porch that listed slightly to the left. Margaret was 31, 7 years older than Eva, and had come west with her late husband 4 years ago and had stayed after he died of a fever because there was, as she put it, simply more money to be made here than back home. "You read my letter," Margaret said. "It was not a question." "I read it twice," Eva said. Margaret looked at her for a long moment, then stood aside. "Come in, then, and eat something before you fall over." They sat at the kitchen table with bread and salt pork and strong coffee, and Margaret talked about Caldwell the way a person talks about a difficult but unavoidable relative, with a mixture of affection and exhaustion. The cattle season was beginning. Cowboys would be flooding up the trail from Texas in the next weeks, and with them would come money, chaos, fights, and the particular brand of desperate living that made frontier towns simultaneously terrible and alive. Margaret had 4 permanent boarders, all of them respectable tradesmen, and she ran a clean house and expected civility, and she had heard no fewer than 3 gunshots since breakfast. "And the warning?" Eva asked, wrapping both hands around her coffee cup. "About this Hugh Barker." Margaret's expression shifted into something complicated. "I meant every word of it." "Tell me more, then. You didn't say much in the letter." "I said enough." "Margaret." Her cousin sighed and set down her fork. "He is a trail boss. Has been for 5 or 6 years. Runs cattle up from Texas for a rancher named Alderton, big spread south of San Antonio. He is good at it, excellent at it, by all accounts, which is why Alderton keeps hiring him, and why the men who ride under him would follow him into a river at flood stage. But he has also been arrested twice, once for a fight in a saloon that sent another man to the doctor for a month, and once for reasons that were never entirely made clear and from which he was eventually released. He drinks not excessively but regularly. He gambles. He is charming in the way that certain men are charming, which is to say that it costs them nothing and costs the women around them considerably more." She paused. "And he is the most handsome man I have seen west of the Mississippi, which makes all of the above considerably more dangerous." Eva was quiet for a moment. "Is he a bad man?" "I don't know," Margaret said honestly. "That's the honest answer. I don't know if he is bad or simply wild, and in my experience the distinction matters less than people think, because the result for the woman involved tends to be the same." Eva nodded slowly. She filed all of it away, in the careful way she had of filing things, not forgetting them, not dismissing them, but not letting them make decisions for her either. She found work the very next morning. The general store on Main Street, Holt's Mercantile, was run by a heavy-set, good-natured man named Frederick Holt, who had more inventory than he could manage, and had been meaning to hire a counter girl for 6 months. Eva walked in, introduced herself, demonstrated that she could count back change without using her fingers, and was hired before noon. The work was straightforward and constant, measuring out flour and coffee and nails and calico by the yard, keeping the ledger, learning the faces of the regulars, and gradually, over the first 2 weeks, becoming one of those quiet, reliable presences that a busy town comes to depend upon without fully noticing. She liked it. She liked the rhythm of it, the accumulation of small transactions that made up a day, the way she came to know the town through what people needed. She liked the women who came in with their careful list of household necessities, and the way some of them had made real lives here, solid and alive, in this rough place that the Eastern papers wrote about as though it were barely civilized. She liked the particular quality of the Kansas light in the late afternoon, copper and vast, falling through the store's single large window. She was arranging a display of canned peaches on the 3rd Thursday of May when the door opened, and the man Margaret had described walked in. She knew it was him before he said a word, which was perhaps foolish, perhaps intuition, perhaps simply the fact that he matched the warning so precisely that she recognized him the way you recognize a weather pattern you have been told to watch for. He was tall, genuinely tall, not just the boots with dark hair that was long enough to curl slightly at the back of his neck, and the particular kind of brown skin that comes from years of outdoor living in a southern sun. His jaw was hard and his eyes were a color she could not immediately name, somewhere between brown and green, and he wore a long duster that was dusty from the trail and a hat that he took off when he came through the door, which was, she thought, a small and telling detail. He set a list on the counter. "Morning," he said. His voice was a low, unhurried thing. "Are you the new counter girl, Holt around?" "Mr. Holt is in the back," Eva said with perfect composure. "I can help you." He slid the list across the counter toward her. It was a substantial order, provisions for a large crew, trail quantities of coffee and dried beans and salt and tobacco, and a number of other things. She read it through without rushing and began to calculate. "You just get in?" she asked, more to be polite than because she needed the answer. "Yesterday evening," he said. 63 days up from San Antonio. He leaned against the counter with a kind of easy unself-consciousness, not a performance of ease but the real thing, the kind that comes from being genuinely comfortable in your own body. Haven't been in Holt since last fall. He hired you recent. 3 weeks ago, Eva said. She looked up from the list. I'm Eva Ellsworth. Something happened in his eyes, a slight sharpening of attention, as though a name had registered that meant something. But it was quick, and he let it pass. Hugh Barker, he said. Pleased to meet you, Miss Ellsworth. She held his gaze for exactly 1 beat longer than was strictly necessary, then returned to the list. She was not going to pretend she had not been warned, but she was also not going to behave badly toward a man she had only just met, based on second-hand account. She was a fair person. She intended to remain one. She filled the order over the next hour, calling for Frederick Holt to help carry several of the heavier sacks out to the wagon that Hugh's segundo, a compact Mexican man named Reyes, who had the economy of movement of someone who had been working cattle since childhood, brought around. Hugh paid in coin, counted it out to the penny, and thanked her by name when he left. She watched him go through the window. Then she went back to the canned peaches. He came back 4 days later, alone this time, for a smaller order: coffee, a new pair of work gloves, and a small bottle of laudanum, which he said was for one of his men who had taken a bad bruise from a horse. He was less trail-worn now, clean-shaved and in a fresh shirt, and she could see more clearly the lines of exhaustion that the trail had put into him. Not weakness, she thought, but experience, the kind of marks that living hard and living honestly leaves on a face. They talked for longer than the transaction required. He asked about Millbrook, Ohio, with what seemed like genuine curiosity rather than social obligation. She told him about it honestly: small, clean, quiet, the kind of quiet that has nothing to do with peace and everything to do with stasis. He listened without filling the pauses, which was rarer than it should have been. She asked about the trail. He talked about it the way she imagined the trail deserved to be talked about, without romance, but without bitterness either, with the plain honesty of someone who has done a hard thing long enough to understand exactly what it is. 63 days. 3 river crossings, one of them during a rise that had cost them 6 head. A week of weather in Indian Territory that had made every man in the outfit quietly religious. The particular loneliness of the last 10 days, when you are close enough to the end to feel it and tired enough to feel the tiredness of your entire life on top of that. You enjoy it? She asked. The trail. He considered the question without deflecting it. There are parts of it I would not trade for anything, he said. And parts of it I am glad to leave behind every time. She thought that was a more honest answer than most people would give. He tipped his hat when he left. She watched him go again. She and Margaret talked about it that evening on the lopsided porch in the blue hour before dark. He came in again, Eva said. I know, Margaret said. I heard. Caldwell was a small town despite its noise. He seems— Eva paused, searching for the right word. Decent. Eva, I am not saying the warning was wrong. I am saying he seems decent. Decent men don't get arrested twice. Decent men don't always avoid trouble, Eva said. Sometimes trouble finds them. Margaret was quiet for a moment, rocking slowly in her chair, looking at the darkening street. Be careful, she said finally. That's all I'm asking. I am always careful, Eva said. And then more quietly, but I am also not made of glass. Hugh Barker's outfit camped on the south side of town while the cattle deal with the buyer, a rancher from Colorado named Dews, was being worked out. It took nearly 2 weeks, because Dews was a careful buyer who counted and recounted, and had a lawyer come up from Wichita to look at the contracts, and Hugh was a careful seller who did not rush a deal simply because he was tired. During those 2 weeks, Eva and Hugh crossed paths nearly every day. It was not arranged. That was what she noticed. He did not manufacture reasons to be in the store. He came in when he needed things, spoke with her honestly when he was there, and did not linger beyond the natural end of a conversation. What he did do was walk past the store in the early evenings when she was locking up, and stop sometimes to exchange a few words, and twice he had walked her as far as the corner of 2nd Street before turning off toward wherever he was going, and those walks, which lasted perhaps 5 minutes each, were among the most alive Eva had felt since arriving in Kansas. She was aware of this. She was aware of herself being aware of it, which she thought was a healthy sign. The town itself was watching, in the idle, insatiable way that small towns watch developing situations. Mrs. Croft, who ran the millinery shop next to the mercantile, had made several pointed comments about Eva being careful with her reputation. The woman in the red dress, whose name, Eva had learned, was Dollars, and who was considerably sharper and kinder than her establishment suggested, gave Eva a long, thoughtful look one afternoon and said, "He is different than the usual trail men," which Eva took as a more nuanced endorsement than the source might suggest. Frederick Holt simply said, one morning over the ledger, "Barker's a straight-dealing man in business. That's all I know." On a warm Friday evening in the middle of May, Hugh asked her if she would walk with him to the edge of town to see the cattle before they were moved out. She said yes. The light was gold and long, and the cattle pen stretched out below a shallow rise, hundreds of longhorns standing in the liquid amber of the late afternoon, and the smell was considerable, but the sight was something. All that wild animal life concentrated in one place, the sound of them, the restless shifting. The drovers moved around the edges on horseback, quiet and methodical. 63 days, she said again, looking at them. Yes, Hugh said. He was standing close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, the stillness of him. You count the miles sometimes, you count the days, but mostly you stop counting and you just live it. She turned to look at him. The sun was directly behind her, and she watched the light hit the side of his face, and she thought, with the calm clarity that sometimes comes before something irrevocable, that she was in a considerable amount of trouble. "What do you do after?" she asked. "When the cattle are sold and the season's over." "I have until October," he said, "before Alderton needs me back in Texas for the fall work. I usually spend the summer somewhere north. I've been to Colorado. Montana once." He glanced at her. "I have never spent a summer in the same place twice." She noticed the way he said it, not with pride but not with apology either, just fact. "Is that what you want?" she asked. "Going forward." He was quiet for a moment. The cattle moved in the pen below them, and the last of the day's gold was fading out of the sky. "I have not thought very hard about what I want going forward," he said. "I think I have been afraid that thinking about it would make the present feel smaller." It was the most revealing thing he had said to her, and she knew he knew it, and she did not make him feel self-conscious about it. "I think about it constantly," she said. "What I want going forward. I came west because I could not stop thinking about it." "What did you find?" he asked. She smiled without looking at him. "I'm still looking." The cattle deal closed on a Monday. Hugh paid his crew, settled his debts with the various merchants in town, and had every logical reason to ride south within the week. He did not. He took a room at the hotel on Main Street, a real room, not a bedroll under a wagon, and he stayed. No one asked him directly why he was staying. In Caldwell, you did not ask a man's reasons for things unless you were prepared to have them asked of you in return. But the staying was noticed, and it was understood, and Eva understood it most clearly of all. They began to spend deliberate time together, which was different from the easy accidental crossings of before. He came to the store and waited for her to finish her shift. She came to the hotel dining room once for supper properly, with Margaret sitting 3 tables away, making no effort at all to pretend she was not watching. They went to the livery stable one afternoon, because she had expressed interest in horses, and he had an extensive and unsentimental knowledge of them. And she stood in the sweet-smelling dark and listened to him talk about the qualities of a good trail horse versus a good working horse, with the focused pleasure of someone learning a real thing. One evening they sat on the steps of the mercantile after closing, with the whole noisy street in front of them and the warm dark above, and he told her about growing up in West Texas. A ranch his father had run, small and stubborn against the landscape. A father who had not been warm but had been honest. a mother who had died when Hugh was 11, and whose absence had reorganized his entire interior world in ways he was still, at 30 years old, mapping. She told him about her mother's Bible in her satchel and why she had brought it, which had nothing to do with religion and everything to do with the smell of it, cedar and old paper, the smell of her mother's hands. She told him about the gray Ohio mornings and the feeling of being 23 years old, with the full weight of a conventional life pressing down on her from every direction, and how the letter had come from Margaret meaning to hold her back, and had instead, in naming something specific and alive in the West, made her pack faster. He looked at her then in the lamplight from the street, and something in his face shifted from guarded to open, a subtle but unmistakable change, and he said, "I am glad the letter didn't stop you." "I read it twice," she said. "I went anyway." "I know," he said. "Margaret told me." She blinked. "She told you." "We had a conversation," he said, with the careful tone of a man who has been spoken to very directly and is reporting it accurately. "She told me about the letter. She told me you had read it twice. She said," he paused, "she said that I should know what kind of woman you are, that you are not impulsive, that you read things twice and make up your own mind." "What did you say to that?" "I said I had already noticed," he said. And the way he said it, simply and without ornamentation, made her chest do something she was not prepared to name in polite company. She looked at him for a long moment. The sounds of Caldwell moved around them, a burst of laughter from the saloon down the street, the measured clopping of a horse being walked somewhere, the distant sound of a fiddle starting up. "The warning Margaret wrote," she said, "the arrest, the fight." He did not look away. "You want to hear about that?" "I think I should." He was quiet for a moment, not evasive but gathering himself, and she respected that. "The fight was 4 years ago," he said. "A man in a saloon in Abilene made a remark about one of my Mexican drovers. A remark I won't repeat. I told him to stop, and he didn't stop, and I hit him. I hit him harder than I intended to, and he hit his head on the bar going down, and it did damage that I have never stopped feeling guilty about. I was arrested, I paid a fine, I visited the man in the doctor's office and offered to pay his medical costs, which he refused. I have not been in a saloon fight since, and I do not intend to be." She nodded. "And the second time?" "That," he said slowly, "is more complicated and more shameful to me, though not in the way you might expect." He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. "I was riding for a man named Koreth in '74. He was moving cattle that were not entirely his. I did not know that when I signed on. I found out partway up the trail. I confronted him. He had me arrested on false charges in Ellsworth to keep me quiet while he completed the sale. The charges were investigated and dropped, and Koreth was eventually prosecuted for the theft, but my name was in the record for the arrest, and that is what people see when they look." Eva listened to the whole of it without interrupting. "And the drinking," she said. "The gambling." "I drink, yes," he said. "I play cards now and then. I have never been drunk on the job, and I have never wagered more than I could afford to lose, which I acknowledge is a low standard. I do not offer you these things as virtues. I tell you because you asked." "I appreciate that," she said, and she meant it. The fiddle down the street had found its footing and was playing something she didn't recognize, something with a long, winding melody like a river seen from above. "Eva," he said, and her name in his voice was a different thing than her name anywhere else. "I am going to be direct with you, because I think you are a person who prefers that." "I am," she said. "I have been in Caldwell for 3 weeks past the point where I had any business reason to stay," he said. "And the reason I have stayed is you. And I think you know that, and I think you have let it happen, and I want to know whether I'm reading that correctly." The directness of it made her heart beat hard. "You are reading it correctly," she said. The expression that moved across his face then was not triumph or relief so much as a kind of homecoming, as though something that had been out of alignment for a long time had quietly settled into place. He did not kiss her that night. He walked her to the corner of 2nd Street, as he had done before, and he held her hand for a moment at the corner, his thumb moving once across her knuckles, slow and certain. And then he let go and said good night and turned back toward the hotel, and Eva stood at the corner for a moment in the warm Kansas dark, feeling every single nerve ending in her right hand. Margaret was waiting on the porch. "Well," she said, "he told me everything," Eva said, sitting down beside her. "About the arrests, all of it." Margaret was quiet for a moment. And I believe him," Eva said. "And I think you knew I would, which is why you had that conversation with him about the letter." Margaret was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "He came to me, actually. He asked me directly what I had written and why. He sat right here on this porch and listened to every concern I had, and he did not argue with a single one of them. He just listened. And then he asked if he could speak to you freely." Eva looked at her cousin. "You didn't tell me that." "I was watching to see what he'd do," Margaret said, a long pause. "He is not what I expected him to be, I will say that much." "What did you expect?" "The same old story," Margaret said softly. "The charming trail man who says the right things and moves on. I have seen it too many times." She looked at Eva. "But the fact that he came to me instead of just proceeding, that was not what I expected." Eva thought about the feel of his thumb crossing her knuckles. "Neither is he," she said. The weeks that followed were the best weeks of Eva Ellsworth's life to that point, and she was fully aware of that while they were happening, which was its own kind of grace. They spent long evenings together, walking the edges of town or sitting in the hotel dining room, or when the evenings were perfect, out on the open prairie just beyond the last buildings, where the sky came down unobstructed and the grass moved in long silver waves in the wind. He taught her to ride properly. She had ridden before in the minimal Ohio way, but he taught her the way a rider rides: weight in the seat, hands light on the reins, the horse as a partner rather than a vehicle. He was a patient teacher, precise and encouraging without being condescending, and the first afternoon she held a canter for 50 yards without grabbing for anything. The way his face lit up made her laugh out loud from sheer happiness. She showed him the Bible in her satchel. He held it carefully, ran his thumb along the worn edge of the cover, and she watched him understand exactly what she had told him about it, that it was not about the text but the object, the sensory memory embedded in it, without her needing to explain further. She met his segundo, Reyes, and liked him immediately. Reyes was 35, formal in the old Spanish way, and he had ridden with Hugh for 7 years, which Eva privately considered the most thorough character reference possible. He treated her with a courtesy that was not performance but genuine respect, and the ease between him and Hugh was the ease of two people who had crossed rivers together at flood stage and still chose each other's company. There was a day, 2 weeks into July, when a man came into the mercantile who changed the temperature of things. His name was Gareth Soules, and he was a buyer who had done business with Alderton Hugh's employer. And he was a heavy, flat-eyed man who stood at the counter and looked at Eva in a way that made Frederick Holt straighten up behind her with the particular protectiveness of a decent older man. Soules made a remark low, the way certain men make remarks, directed ostensibly at Frederick but loud enough for Eva, that she was a handsome girl for a Kansas shopkeeper, and what a waste. Eva replied to it in the cool, even tone she had developed for exactly this type of situation, and Soules paid for his goods and left, and Frederick Holt said, "Good girl," which she appreciated even though she did not need it. She mentioned it to Hugh that evening. What she did not expect was the stillness that came over him, not anger exactly, but a kind of compressed alertness, like an animal at the edge of a field. "Soules," he said. "You know him." "He does business with Alderton," Hugh said. "I have had dealings with him. He is not a good man." "I handled it," Eva said. "I know you did," he said, and the way he said it was immediate and sure, no doubt in it at all. "I'm not suggesting otherwise." He was quiet for a moment. "Is he still in town?" "I don't know," she said. "Hugh," he looked at her. "I handled it," she said again evenly. "I don't need a rescue, but I do need to know that when I tell you something happened to me, you hear what I am saying and not what your instincts want to do about it." He held her gaze, and then something in him, that compressed alertness, released. "You're right," he said. "I heard you. I'm sorry." It was such a clean apology, so uncomplicated by defensiveness, that it settled something in her that she hadn't realized was unsettled. "Thank you," she said. Soules left town the next day, heading south. Hugh did not seek him out, and Eva noticed that, and it meant something to her. By August, the question of what came next was present in every conversation like a river running underneath, audible but not yet addressed directly. The trail season would end. Hugh would have obligations in Texas by October. Eva had a life small and new, but real, in Caldwell. She lay awake some nights thinking about it with the clear-eyed practicality that she applied to most things, trying to look at the shape of the problem honestly. She was not going to ask him to give up his work for her. It would be asking him to give up himself. She was not going to follow a man to Texas simply because she had feeling for him, not without more certainty than they had yet spoken into existence. But the feeling was large and growing, and the conversations they were having by unspoken mutual agreement were circling closer to the center of it every day. The conversation happened on a Sunday evening in late August, on the open prairie at the edge of town, with a sky full of stars so dense they looked like they might come loose and fall. She had been quiet for a while, and he had let her be quiet, which was one of the things about him that she had come to love most. Then she said, "Tell me about Texas." He knew what she was asking. He didn't pretend otherwise. "Alderton's ranch is near San Antonio," he said. "Good land, dry but good. I have a room there through the working months, and there's a small town, Pina Creek, about 8 miles out. Nothing like Caldwell, quieter. A church, a school, a couple of streets." He paused. "It is not Ohio quiet, it is different. It's a working quiet." "And what do you do in the winter between seasons?" "Manage the fall stock," he said. "Fence work, some of the horses." "I have been talking to Alderton about taking on more of the ranch management, not just the trail work. There might be a future in that doesn't require 63 days on the road twice a year." She turned to look at him. "You've been thinking about that," she said. "Since June," he said. He met her eyes. "Since meeting you." She felt the weight of it, the full weight of him saying that honestly. "Hugh," she said, "I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight," he said. "I'm telling you what's on my mind because you deserve to know it. You said you prefer direct, and I do too with you. I don't know how to be indirect with you is the truth." "What are you hoping for?" she said. "Say it plainly." He took a breath. "I'm hoping," he said, "that you will consider coming to Texas, not to follow me, not that. But because I think we might be something real, you and I don't want to find out by letter from 1,000 miles away." He paused. "I'm hoping that if you came, and if it was what I believe it would be, that you would consider staying, permanently." The stars above them were very still. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she said, because she was a person who preferred direct. He almost smiled. "Not yet," he said. "I'm asking whether you would consider the possibility of being asked." "Which I acknowledge is a somewhat less romantic formulation." "It is very you," she said. "Is that a bad thing?" She looked at him for a long moment, at the strong, honest lines of his face, at the way the starlight sat on him, at the man who had come to her cousin's porch and listened without arguing, and had never once tried to charm her out of her own clear thinking. "No," she said, "it is not a bad thing at all." She wrote to her mother that week, a long letter, the longest she had written since leaving Ohio, in which she tried to explain Hugh Barker in a way that would make her mother understand rather than simply worry. She described his steadiness, his honesty, the way he had heard her cousin's warning and met it head-on rather than deflecting it. She described Texas the way Hugh had described it, dry and good, a working quiet. She wrote at the end that she was not certain yet of exactly what shape the future would take, but that she was more certain of the man in it than she had been certain of anything in a long time. Her mother wrote back within 2 weeks, which was fast for the mail. The letter was 2 pages and largely devoted to questions about the state of Texas churches and the availability of doctors, which Eva translated accurately as conditional approval. Margaret was less conditional. "You're going," she said, on the porch on the last evening of August, the two of them watching the street. "I haven't decided," Eva said. Margaret gave her a look of considerable patience. "You're going," she said again. "And that is all right, Eva. I want you to know that. I was afraid. I wrote that letter because I was afraid for you, and I do not regret writing it. But I have watched this man with you for 3 months, and I think," she paused and seemed to be choosing her words carefully, "I think he sees you. Not who he wants you to be. You. And that is not a common thing." Eva was quiet for a moment, feeling the truth of it. "He does," she said softly. "Then go," Margaret said, "and write to me every week. And if it ever goes wrong, you come back here and I will have a room for you." "It won't go wrong." "I know," Margaret said, "but knowing that you have the room makes you brave to go, I think." Eva laughed and leaned her head against her cousin's shoulder for a moment, and the porch creaked under both of them in the warm night. Before the question of Texas was fully resolved, however, something happened that resolved it faster and more completely than any deliberate decision might have. It happened on the first Friday of September. A man named Dale Coffin, who had ridden in Hugh's crew for 2 of the 3 seasons and been let go this past spring for repeated unreliability, was in town and was drunk, and had apparently spent considerable energy convincing himself over the summer that his dismissal had been both unjust and specifically Hugh's fault. He found Hugh on Main Street in the early afternoon, outside the hotel, and there was a confrontation vocal, public, the kind that draws a crowd on a Caldwell afternoon as reliably as anything. Eva was at the counter of the Mercantile and heard the voices rise outside and went to the window. She saw Hugh standing on the boards outside the hotel with his arms loose at his sides, not ready for a fight, but not retreating from one either. Coffin was pacing, his voice carrying clearly through the glass, a recitation of grievances that escalated in volume if not in coherence. A small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance, because Caldwell was a town that understood the grammar of these situations. What she watched from behind the glass was Hugh refuse to fight, not back down refuse. He stood his ground, he listened. He said things she could not hear but whose effect she could see in the way Coffin's pacing grew more frustrated rather than more escalated. At one point, Hugh raised both hands empty and said something at length, and whatever he said made Coffin go still for a long moment, and then Coffin said something back and turned and walked away, and the crowd dispersed, and Hugh stood for a moment alone on the boards outside the hotel. Eva walked out of the Mercantile. He saw her coming and something in his face relaxed. "You saw that," he said. "What did you say to him?" she asked. "I told him he was right that I had let him go," Hugh said. "I told him the reasons I had done it and that they still stood, but that I was sorry he was in a bad way and that I hoped things improved for him." He paused. "I also told him that if he drew on me I would defend myself, and that I did not think either of us wanted that." She stood in front of him on the boards and looked at him and felt the particular kind of clarity that sometimes arrives not as a thought but as a physical certainty, the way you know when a sky is about to break. "I'll come to Texas," she said. He blinked. "Eva, I was going to wait and decide properly," she said, "but I don't think I need more information. I have watched you long enough." He looked at her with that open expression she had come to recognize as the realist version of him. "You are sure?" "I'm the kind of person who reads things twice before deciding," she said. "I have been reading you all summer." A sound behind them, someone's horse being walked past, a child shouting somewhere down the street, the ordinary noise of an ordinary afternoon in a thoroughly unordinary town. And Hugh Barker, trail boss, ex-two-time arrest, the man the letter had warned her against, reached out and took her hand on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in front of whoever was watching, and held it. "All right," he said. "All right then." The preparations took 3 weeks, which felt both too long and not long enough. Eva gave her notice at Holt's Mercantile, and Frederick Holt shook her hand with genuine feeling and said she was the best counter girl he had hired, and that if she ever came back north she had a job. She packed her trunk again, more carefully this time, and repacked it twice. She bought a good pair of riding boots, proper ones, not the light Ohio shoes she had arrived in, because Hugh told her plainly that the country between Caldwell and San Antonio was not country for light shoes. She had her last long evening on the porch with Margaret, and Margaret filled a basket with preserves and dried apple rings and 2 jars of her good coffee grounds, which Eva accepted as the love language it was. They held each other for a long time at the end of it, and Margaret whispered into her hair, "I was wrong about him," and Eva said, "You were right to warn me," and they were both telling the truth. The party that rode south from Caldwell on a cool September morning consisted of Hugh, Eva, Rays, and two other drovers from the outfit named Campos and Tom Bright, who were heading back to Texas, and happy for the company. Eva rode a sturdy gray mare that Hugh had found for her, a 5-year-old, calm and sure-footed, with a steady mouth, and she rode her well. And when they cleared the last buildings of Caldwell and the Kansas plain opened up ahead of them, vast and golden and rolling all the way to the horizon, she felt something close the door on the first half of her life and opened the second. The ride south was 11 days. It would have been shorter without detours for weather and one slow river crossing, the Cimarron, low in September but tricky with quicksand along the banks. But it was the first journey Eva had made that did not feel like an interval between places. It felt itself like a place, like a way of living. She and Hugh rode side by side through most of the open country, and the conversations they had on horseback, with the land rolling out in every direction and the enormous sky holding everything, were different from their conversations in Caldwell, less guarded, somehow more exploratory. They talked about things they had not yet gotten to, what he believed and did not believe, what she thought about the way the country was changing, what they each thought they might regret if they did not do it, what they each thought they already regretted and had made a kind of peace with. She asked him once, somewhere in Indian Territory, riding through a stretch of country that was beautiful and contested and present in a way she had no adequate language for, whether he had ever thought hard about what was being lost here. She chose the words carefully, but she meant them seriously. He was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "I have thought about it. The drives go through territory that is not ours to drive through, not really, or it was not meant to be. The agreements have been made and broken so many times that I think most of the men in the business have simply stopped looking at what they're walking through." He paused. "I am not going to tell you that I've found a way to do this work with a clean conscience entirely. I can't, but I have tried to conduct myself within it with respect for the land and for the people whose land it is. Whether that is enough, I don't know." It was not the comfortable answer, and she liked him for not reaching for it. They crossed into Texas in late September, and the country changed: shorter grass, harder rock, the air drier and warmer and cleaner in a way that had its own beauty, once you stopped expecting it to look like the North. The ranch at Alderton Spread was a broad, low complex of buildings in the long valley of a creek, surrounded by working land that stretched as far as the eye could organize. It was not beautiful in the way Ohio was beautiful or Kansas was beautiful. It was beautiful in its own austere and unhurried way, and Eva, standing in the yard on the afternoon they arrived, felt the particular pleasure of arriving somewhere completely new and finding it interesting rather than strange. Joseph Alderton was a gray, weathered man in his late 60s who had been building his cattle operation for 30 years and who shook Eva's hand with the pragmatism of a man who had dealt with enough surprises in his life to take them calmly. His wife, Clara, was a small, direct woman of 60 who looked Eva over with the frankness of someone who sees no point in being subtle at her age, and then said, "You'll do fine," which Eva gathered was a significant endorsement. Clara showed her the room that had been prepared, a small, tidy room at the end of the main house, her own room, because whatever she and Hugh were to each other, they were not married yet, and Clara Alderton ran a correct house and would not have it otherwise, a position Eva respected and Hugh had clearly anticipated. That evening at supper, Alderton talked to Hugh about the fall work fence lines down in the lower pasture, a new stock arrangement, preliminary thoughts about the spring drive. Eva sat and listened and found herself understanding more than she expected to from 3 months of listening to Hugh talk about ranching, and once offered an observation about the spring timing that Alderton received with mild surprise and then with approval. After supper, Hugh walked her out to the edge of the yard, where the last of the day's light was a deep red line at the horizon. "You're not overwhelmed," he said. "Should I be? Some people are." "I am interested," she said, "which is different." He stood beside her, looking at the red horizon, and she could feel him deciding to say something. "I spoke to Alderton today," he said, "before supper. I asked him about taking on more of the management work, what we discussed in Caldwell. He said yes, it would mean less trail time and more this." He gestured at the ranch around them. "Staying in one place, building something here." She turned to look at him. "And what do you want?" she asked. The same question she had asked at the cattle pens in May, the one that had told her something important. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. Simply, directly, no preamble. "I am asking you to marry me. I have a ring. Alderton's wife gave me her mother's, which she has been keeping for years for reasons she said were Clara's own business." He reached into his vest pocket and produced a small gold ring with a single pale blue stone. "I don't have a speech prepared. You know everything about me. I know everything about you that matters, and I want to spend the rest of my life knowing the rest." The red line at the horizon was deepening to purple. Eva looked at the ring and then at the man holding it, and she thought about the letter, about the warning, about the name she had read twice and then gone looking for, and about the summer, the whole long Kansas summer and the ride south, and the 11 days of conversation on horseback across a country vast enough to hold all of it. "Yes," she said. He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit as though it had been made for her, which she took as a sign, despite not being superstitious. Then he kissed her for the first time, which she had been, she realized, waiting for since the first evening she had walked beside him down a Caldwell street, and it was not a small thing, not a polite thing. It was real and unhurried and entirely itself, like everything else about him. Clara Alderton appeared on the back porch of the house a moment later, not by accident, and said, "Well, thank God," and went back inside. They were married in October. The ceremony was held at the small church in Pina Creek, a plain wooden building with uneven benches and a minister named Reverend Cole, who had a booming voice disproportionate to the size of his congregation. The party was small: the Aldertons, Ray's and his wife Luciana, Tom Bright, a few of the other ranch hands and their families, the schoolteacher from Pina Creek who had already met Eva twice and developed a quick and warm regard for her. There were wildflowers on the window ledges, gathered that morning by Luciana's daughters, and the autumn light came through the plain glass windows and made everything warm and golden and very clean. Eva wore a blue dress that Clara had helped her alter from a length of fabric she'd brought from a shop in San Antonio, not elaborate, but good cloth, well fitted. Margaret had sent a gift ahead, a set of fine linen with a note that said, "The room is still here if you need it, but I know you won't." And Eva had read the note 3 times. Hugh wore his good suit and looked, Eva thought, like himself, which was the best thing she could say about any person's wedding appearance. They said their vows in the plain, direct way that matched both of them, and when it was done and they were standing in the autumn light outside the church with their friends around them, Eva felt a happiness so whole and unambiguous that she had to simply stand still inside it for a moment, because it was the kind of thing you did not want to rush through. The reception was held at the Alderton Ranch, on the wide porch and in the yard, with a fiddle player from town and good food, and the particular loosened warmth of people genuinely happy for each other. Ray's made a toast in both English and Spanish that made Luciana cry and made Hugh look at the ground and smile. Tom Bright told a story about the Cimarron crossing that was probably somewhat embellished but was entirely entertaining. At the end of the night, when the yard had quieted and the stars were out and the last of their guests were making their way home, Hugh and Eva stood at the edge of the porch and she leaned against him and he wrapped his arm around her and they looked at the sky and said nothing for a while, because they did not need to. "I want to send Margaret a longer letter this week," Eva said at last. "She'll want details," Hugh said. "She'll get them," Eva said. "Every one. The first winter on the Alderton Ranch was a learning season for Eva, and she was a willing learner. She helped Clara with the house management, which was in reality a small-scale logistical operation involving the care and feeding of a working crew, and she brought to it the same focused competence she had brought to the mercantile counter. She learned the rhythms of the ranch year, the fall mending and fence work, the careful management of winter stock, the early spring preparations that built toward the trail season. She learned the geography of the land, riding out with Hugh on the days when the weather allowed, learning the names of the creeks and the quality of the grass, and the character of different sections of the range. She started a small lending library in Pena Creek. It began because she had brought 3 boxes of books from Ohio, her books, accumulated since childhood, and the schoolteacher, whose name was Anna Wellen, had asked if she might borrow a particular volume, and the conversation had expanded from there. Within 3 months, the lending library was operating out of a corner of Anna's schoolroom and had more volumes than Eva had arrived with, because books had a way of finding libraries once they knew one existed. Hugh watched this enterprise develop with the particular attentiveness of a man who finds a person he loves more interesting and surprising every time he looks. "You're building a library," he said, one evening in January. "I am," she said, "in a town with 40 families. 40 families need a library more than 400, she said. When you have 400 families, you have enough people that someone might build one for you. When you have 40, you build it yourself." He looked at her the way he had been looking at her since October, as though he had been given something he had not expected and was still not entirely used to the gift of it. "I love you," he said, which was something he had begun to say with the regularity of a man who had come late to the saying of it and intended to make up for the delay. "I love you," she said back, with equal simplicity, and he leaned across the table and kissed her temple, and she went on reading her book. Spring came, and with it the preliminary work of the new trail season, and Eva watched Hugh leave for the lower pastures in the early mornings with a different kind of engagement than she had felt watching anyone do anything before. This was not idle interest. This was paying attention to a life she was part of. He had taken on the full ranch management role, as Alderton had agreed, which meant he would lead the spring drive north one more season, Alderton said, and after that they would hire a new trail boss for the northern runs and Hugh would manage from the ranch. Hugh had accepted this without visible regret, though Eva watched him in the weeks before the drive and knew there was something he was working through, not reluctance, exactly, but the particular feeling of setting down a thing you have carried for a long time, which is never entirely uncomplicated even when it is right. On the evening before the drive left, they sat together in the kitchen with the lamp between them, and she said, "Tell me what you're feeling." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm feeling that this might be the last time I do this," he said, "and I am feeling all the years I have done it all at once." "Is that grief?" she asked. "For the ending of it?" "Maybe a little," he said honestly, "but mostly it feels like completion. Like something that was the right thing for a long time and is now going to be the right thing in a different way." She nodded slowly. "Come back safe," she said. "I will," he said, and the way he said it was not casual, it was a commitment, deliberate and full. He kissed her goodbye in the yard at first light, with Ray's and the crew already mounted and waiting at the respectful distance of people who have seen this kind of goodbye before, and then he was riding south, a trail boss in the pale early spring, and Eva stood in the yard until the dust settled, and then she went back into the house and started her day. He was gone for 8 weeks. They were not easy weeks, but they were not wasted ones. Eva threw herself into the work of the ranch and the library and the life of Pena Creek, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was capable of a great deal on her own, had always been capable of a great deal on her own, had come west on her own and built a life in Caldwell on her own, and made every important decision in the past year by her own careful judgment. She was not a woman who needed to be managed or supplemented. She was a woman who was more complete with Hugh than without him, which was a different thing and a better one. Anna Wellen became a real friend during those 8 weeks. A small, energetic woman from Connecticut who had come west on a teaching contract 2 years ago and had stayed because she liked it and because there was, she said, nothing in Connecticut that she needed that she couldn't build here. They had long conversations about the state of education on the frontier and about the Indian Territory they had both traveled through and about what the West was and what it might become, and these conversations fed something in Eva that she had not realized was hungry. She also began to write, not letters, something else. Observations at first, short descriptions of the ranch and the land and the sky and the people, written in the plain, direct style that came naturally to her. Then something longer, a kind of account of the year, her year, from Ohio to Caldwell to Texas. She was not sure what it was becoming, but she wrote it in the mornings before the day started, and she kept the pages in the back of her satchel, and she told no one about it. Hugh came back on a May afternoon, trail-worn and somewhat leaner and with the particular aliveness that the trail put in him, and he came through the yard gate and she came off the porch and they held each other for a long time without saying anything, just standing in the May afternoon with the horses watching. "How was it?" she asked when they had separated enough to see each other's faces. "Good drive," he said. "Clean. No river trouble." He was looking at her the way he always looked at her when he came back, as though checking that she was real. "You look well." "I feel well," she said. "Come in and eat." He ate and told her about the drive in the unhurried way of a man who knows the story will be listened to, and she told him about the library and Anna and the writing in the mornings. And when she told him about the writing, he got very still and very attentive and said, "Can I read it?" She considered. "Not yet," she said, "but eventually." "All right," he said without pushing, which she loved. That summer, Alderton announced his intention to retire within the year and to sell the operation, not the land, which he was keeping for his children, but the cattle operation and the management rights, and he wanted, he said, to sell it to someone who would keep it honest. He looked at Hugh when he said this, in the way of a man delivering a speech he has prepared in advance. Hugh was quiet for a long time after Alderton finished talking. "That would require capital I don't have," he said. "Not as much as you think," Alderton said. "I have priced it for you specifically." Eva listened to the conversation, and that evening, after Alderton and Clara had gone in, she told Hugh about a sum she had not previously mentioned, money left to her by her grandfather, held in a Cincinnati bank that she had never found the right use for. Hugh looked at her. "Eva, it is my money," she said. "I decide what to use it for. And I can think of nothing I would rather use it for than this." "It's a large risk," he said. "I'm a person who reads warnings twice and makes up her own mind," she said. He started to say something and then stopped, and she could see him working through the magnitude of it, not just the money but the partnership, the full weight of her choosing this alongside him, and she let him work through it because it deserved that. "Together," he said at last. Not a question, a naming of what it was. "Together," she said. They bought the operation from Alderton the following spring: cattle, contracts, the working lease of the grazing land, everything that went with it. Hugh managed it with the same clear-eyed competence he had brought to everything else, and Eva was in it fully alongside him: the books, the purchasing decisions, the arrangements with buyers and suppliers, the staff management. The work was hard and constant and interesting, and they did it well together, which was perhaps the deepest pleasure of all of it. They hired a new trail boss for the northern runs, a steady, laconic man from Tennessee named Burl Abbott, who came with solid references and proved them out in the first season. Ray stayed on as the senior drover and took on more of the operational management of the trail end, which he did with the same quiet excellence he brought to everything. The operation ran. In the fall of 1880, Eva discovered she was pregnant. She told Hugh on a September morning in the kitchen, directly, in the way she told him everything. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her for a moment with an expression that started as surprise and moved through something more complex and arrived at a happiness so complete and unguarded that she felt it like warmth. He crossed the kitchen and took her face in both hands and said nothing for a moment. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "I am happy." "So am I," he said, and kissed her forehead and her cheek and the bridge of her nose, which was something he did when he did not know which part of her to hold on to first. She wrote the longest letter she had written yet to her mother and to Margaret. Her mother wrote back with detailed advice about practically every aspect of pregnancy, delivery, and infant care, some of it contradictory, all of it loving. Margaret wrote a single sentence of advice: sleep when you can, eat what you want, and do not let anyone tell you how to feel about it. And then 3 full pages of joy. The baby arrived in May of 1881, on a warm evening with a sunset that turned the whole sky pink and gold, delivered by a competent midwife from Pena Creek named Rosa, who had been through this dozens of times, and managed the entire business with a calm that Eva found enormously reassuring. It was a boy. They named him James Ellsworth Barker, James for Hugh's father, a man he had complicated feelings about but had come to understand better as he grew into his own version of a man, and Ellsworth for Eva's family, and because she had carried the name West and it had brought her here and she wanted it to go forward. Hugh held James for the first time in the lamplight of the bedroom, and Eva, exhausted and present and completely awake in the way that a person is sometimes awake at the most important moments of their life, watched the tenderness in this man who had been built by hard country and hard work and had somewhere inside him, all along, the capacity for this particular kind of softness. He looked up and found her watching. "He has your eyes," he said. "He has your nose," she said. "God help him," he said, and she laughed, and James startled at the sound of it and then settled, which was perhaps the truest summary of the next several years anyone could have offered. Anna Wellen came to see the baby and stayed for 3 hours, which was appropriate for both the occasion and their friendship. Reyes and Luciana came with their daughters, who were fascinated by the baby and treated him with the solemnity of small professionals. Clara Alderton, retired now to a smaller house in town, came and held James and cried a little and then denied crying. Her parents came that summer, making the long journey from Ohio with a hesitancy that had nothing to do with willingness, and everything to do with the enormity of the undertaking for 2 people in their 60s who had not been farther west than Cincinnati. Eva met them at the Pena Creek station with James on her hip, and her mother burst into tears at the sight of her, and then at the sight of the baby, and her father shook Hugh's hand for a long time and said, "She chose well," which was the highest praise her father had ever given anyone in Eva's memory. They stayed for 2 weeks, and her mother and Clara Alderton took to each other immediately, which was a relief, and her father and Hugh spent long hours on the porch in the evenings talking about cattle and land in a way that seemed to suit them both. When they left, her mother pressed another Bible into her hands, a new one, with James's name written inside the cover, and held Eva's face for a moment and looked at her, the full looking of a mother who wants to see every detail of her child's happiness, and then nodded once, as though confirming something she had hoped for. The operation grew. Not spectacularly, not the way the big Texas ranches grew, but steadily and well, in the patient accumulating way of people who are building something they intend to keep. They bought a small section of land adjacent to their grazing lease, their own land, and built a house on it, not elaborate, but real, with a kitchen large enough for company and a porch that ran the full width of the front, and a room that became Eva's writing room, which Hugh built her at one end of the house without being asked, simply announcing one morning that he was adding a room and here were the dimensions, and what did she think? She finished the account of her first year west in that room, in the mornings, in the quiet working hour before James woke up. She sent it to a newspaper in San Antonio, and they published 3 parts of it in successive issues, and the editor wrote to ask if she had more. She had considerably more. She began to write regularly, and the writing was not separate from her life on the ranch but continuous with it. The same clear attention, the same patience with what was actually true, applied to the page. Margaret visited in the spring of 1882, the first time she had been south, and she arrived on a Thursday afternoon and stood in the yard of the new house and looked at all of it, the house and the corrals and the porch, and Eva coming across the yard to meet her with James on one hip and a pen still in her other hand. And she said, very quietly so that only Eva heard it, "I was so wrong." "You were not wrong," Eva said. "You were careful. There's a difference." "He has been good to you," Margaret said. It was not a question. "He has been extraordinary," Eva said, "every single day." Hugh came around from the barn then, and he saw Margaret and walked over and shook her hand and said he was glad she had come, and Margaret looked at him for a moment, this man she had warned her cousin against, this trail boss with the long reputation and the easy smile, and said, "Thank you for coming to my porch." "Thank you for telling me the truth," he said. Margaret nodded once, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. That evening, all 4 of them sat on the wide porch, Hugh and Eva and Margaret and Anna, who had been invited for supper, and James fell asleep in his grandfather's arms in Eva's account of the story, but that came later. That evening James fell asleep in Margaret's arms while she rocked slowly, and the sky over Texas turned its spectacular colors, that overlong beautiful burning that the western sky did in the evenings, and they talked and listened to each other, and the porch held all of them. And Eva sat against Hugh's side with her hand in his and felt, as she felt every evening, the completeness of this, the full-bodied sense of having made exactly the right choices, the improbable stacking of them. Beginning with a letter she had read twice and disregarded. She thought sometimes about the woman who had stood at the train station in Millbrook, Ohio, with her mother's Bible and her packed trunk and Margaret's warning folded in her satchel. That woman had been brave in the way that people are brave when they are not yet sure they can do a thing, tentatively, at a cost. She was still brave, Eva thought, but differently now. The way you are brave when you have been somewhere real and come through it and built a life with both hands, alongside someone who built it with you. A second pregnancy came in the fall of 1883, planned, this time, in the sense that they had talked about it and wanted it, though the actual arrival of the news was still a particular kind of joy. This time it was a girl. They named her Clara Margaret Barker, Clara for the woman who had given them a ring and said, "Well, thank God," and Margaret for the cousin who had written the letter that had started everything, and who cried for a full paragraph of her reply when they told her. Clara Margaret was born on a December morning, winter-white and sharp, and she arrived in the world with the same unhurried certainty as everything else that year. James, 2.5, was brought in to meet her, and stood at the bedside with an expression of concentrated seriousness that made Hugh have to turn away and compose himself. The house was full that winter. Her parents came back for Christmas, and Margaret made the journey again with 2 of her boarders who had become, over the years, close to family. The table was loud and the food was abundant, and James sat between Hugh's father's stories and his grandmother's songs, and Clara Margaret slept through most of it in the steady, confident way of a baby who has decided the world is exactly as it should be. On the last evening of the year, after the house was quiet and both children were asleep and the guests were settled, Hugh and Eva stood on the porch in the cold December dark, wrapped against the chill, looking at the sky that was clear and enormous and flung with stars. 1883, he said. It's been a year. It's been many years, she said. All stacked up. Tell me what you think about when you're out here at night, he said. It was the kind of question he still asked. After 5 years, after 2 children, after the house they had built and the ranch they ran and the account of it she was still writing. He was still curious about her. It still mattered to him what was inside her head. She thought for a moment. I think about Millbrook, she said, not with longing, just remembering it, the gray mornings, The way the life there had a shape that was already decided. She paused, and then I think about the letter and reading it twice and packing my trunk. And then you, she said. He tightened his arm around her. I am glad every day, he said, that you read it twice and came anyway. So am I, she said. The night was cold and very still, and the stars above Texas were the same stars they had stood under in Caldwell, Kansas, that first summer. The same stars they had talked under from horseback crossing Indian Territory. The same stars that had watched them build this life from its foundation up. They were not young and unknowing anymore, standing under them. They were known to each other in the deepest possible way, in the accumulating way that only shared years can build, and the life they had made together was visible around them in every direction. The house with its lit windows, the corrals and barns, the sleeping children inside, the library in Pina Creek with its growing shelves, the published pages with Eva's name on them, the operational books balanced in her hand. Hugh turned and looked at her in the cold light. I love you, he said. I love you, she said back, completely, every day. He kissed her in the cold, on the porch of their own house, under the Texas stars, and it was as real and unhurried as the first one had been, and better for everything that had come between, the drives and the seasons and the arguments they had had and resolved, and the griefs they had each known and held for each other, and the two children asleep inside, and the 1,000 ordinary mornings of a life being lived fully and on their own terms. When they went inside and closed the door against the December cold, the porch light stayed on, steady and warm in the dark, and the stars kept their watch overhead. And inside the house the new year was already beginning, quiet and certain and full. Eva's account of her journey west was published as a collected volume the following spring by a small press in San Antonio, bound in green cloth with her name on the cover, Eva Barker. It was reviewed in 4 Texas newspapers and 2 in Kansas, and a review in the Caldwell paper mentioned that the author had spent time in Caldwell in the summer of 1878, which prompted 3 separate letters from people who remembered her behind the counter at Holt's Mercantile. Margaret sent a copy of the Caldwell Review with a note that said, "They remember you well. They should." Frederick Holt wrote a short letter of congratulation that was formal and warm in equal measure. Anna Wellen read the volume in 2 sittings and arrived at the ranch the next morning with red eyes and said it was exactly right, exactly what it had been like, and that she was proud to be in it. Hugh read it last. She had wanted him to be the last, because it was written for him in some way she had not realized until it was done, not dedicated to him, but directed at him. The account of everything that had brought them to each other and everything that had come after. He read it over 3 evenings slowly, and when he finished the last page he closed the cover and set it on the table and sat for a long time. Then he said, "You should write another one." She laughed. "Should I?" "Yes," he said. "This one was the beginning, write the middle." "We're in the middle," she pointed out. "Then write it while it's happening," he said. "Don't wait until it's done." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight in the house they had built, with the children asleep down the hall and the ranch running beyond the windows and the whole long, magnificent story of their life available to her in every direction she looked. "All right," she said. "I will." And she did. James Barker grew up tall and curious, and with his father's steadiness, and his mother's habit of reading things twice before deciding. Clara Margaret grew up quick and certain, and with her father's ease in the saddle and her mother's facility with words. The ranch prospered. The library in Pina Creek grew until it needed its own building, which the town provided in 1886, and Eva Barker was present at the opening with both children and her husband and Margaret, who had finally, after considerable correspondence from Eva and one frank conversation with Hugh, agreed to leave Caldwell and move to Texas, where she opened a new boarding house in San Antonio and was immediately, tremendously successful. The Kishom Trail narrowed and faded as the railroads pushed further south, and the great drives that had made Caldwell and a dozen towns like it began to decline, And the West that Eva had come to in 1878 was already becoming something different, more settled, more defined. But the core of it, the quality of living that she had come west to find, the bigness of the sky and the realness of the work, and the people who built honest lives in hard country, that was still present, still the thing it had been, and she was still in it and grateful for it every day. In 1888, 10 years after a letter had arrived in Millbrook, Ohio, and been read twice, and disregarded, Eva Barker sat on her porch on a spring evening and watched Hugh come in from the south pasture on the big bay he had been riding for 3 years. And she watched the way he sat the horse easy and certain, that same ease that had been the first thing she had noticed about him. And she thought about the letter and the warning and the twice-read name, and she thought about the woman she had been, and the woman she was, and the immeasurable distance between them that was not distance at all but simply time, and love, and the life you make when you choose it clearly with both eyes open. Hugh dismounted at the gate and looked up and saw her on the porch and raised his hand. She raised hers back. James came running from around the house, 6 years old and loud about it, and Hugh caught him and swung him up, and James shrieked with the pure joy of being caught. And Clara Margaret came more sedately from the porch steps, 7 years old and dignified, and Hugh set James down and held his hand out to Clara, and she took it, and they came up the path together, the 3 of them, toward the porch and the lamplight and home. This was the life she had read the warning for. This was the life she had packed her trunk and boarded the westbound train and gone anyway to find. Not despite the warning, but because of it, because it had put a name on something real, and real things were worth the risk of them, worth reading twice and going toward anyway with clear eyes and a full heart. Hugh came up the porch steps and stood beside her and looked at the evening, the spring evening, the long gold light over Texas. "Good day," he said. "Good day," she said. James was already inside making noise. Clara Margaret had followed him, already engaged in the elaborate management of her younger brother that she had taken up as her principal vocation. The house was full of sound and light. Hugh put his arm around her. She leaned into him, and the porch held them, and the evening held the porch, and the sky above Texas held everything, vast and indifferent and beautiful, the same sky it had always been, the same sky it would always be, bearing its patient witness to the small, irreplaceable lives being lived well beneath it.